Okay, so like imagine this, you're on Mars, right? Red dust is like swirling all around you, but it's not just the landscape. An amazing view. You see like all this stuff from old missions just scattered about, a heat shield, maybe a parachute, tangled up like a kite, someone forgot.
Hmm.
Is that just trash though, or?
Well, that's kind of the cool part, right? There's this whole field, like it's growing really fast, called space archaeology, and they look at all that stuff not as junk, but like
Yeah,
artifacts.
pieces of history, right?
Hmm.
We're looking at this article today from Nature Astronomy. Anthropologist wrote it, Justin Holcomb. And his argument is it's not just about like cleaning up after ourselves out there.
Yeah.
It's about like understanding the value of all that stuff we left.
Hmm.
Even if it's something as simple as like a piece of Dacron netting from some thermal blanket.
Right. It really is a whole different way of thinking about it.
Totally.
Instead of like, oh, that's garbage. It's like, wait, this is a record of what we did, how we did it, what went wrong.
It's like if archaeologists, here on Earth dug up a landfill.
Hmm.
I mean, to us, it's trash, but
Right.
to them, it's a gold mine. It
Mhm.
tells them, how we lived, what we used, what was important. And Mars is becoming that kind of time capsule for like our first steps out into space.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just like a theory,
Mhm.
We can already see how important some of this early stuff is. Think of the first thing humans ever put on Mars wasn't even a successful landing.
Real.
It was the Mars 2 rover from the Soviets, crashed back in 1971.
Wow. So even a crash is like a big deal in space history. What do you think is like the most important thing we've left on Mars?
Ooh, that's a tough
I
one.
don't know, right?
Besides like the obvious stuff, the rovers and landers.
Right.
I think the stuff we didn't even mean to leave is super interesting, like rover tracks.
Oh, yeah, just crisscrossing the planet. It's wild to think about those trash just sitting there for like centuries, maybe thousands of years. Do you think future archaeologists will be like us, looking at, footprints in volcanic ash?
Yeah. That's a great question, and it brings up a really important point. Martian archaeology isn't just about like listing what's there, it's about understanding where it is, what's around it, and what it says about us.
So as cool as Martian archaeology is, I bet it's not as simple as like digging stuff up here.
Oh no, not at all.
Right.
Mars is a whole different ballgame. That environment, the dust storms, the crazy temperatures, the sand, it all affects how things get preserved or don't get preserved. And we're only just starting to figure that out.
Yeah, I read that the iron in the sand like makes metal rust way faster than it would here. And those dust storms,
Mm-hmm.
they could bury things in like a couple days. It's like a constant fight against nature.
Totally. And we're seeing it happen right now, like the Spirit rover. It's slowly getting swallowed by a dune field. This amazing piece of tech, a symbol of everything we can do. It's turning into a time capsule buried under Martian sand.
That's kind of beautiful, but also sad. If we don't protect this stuff, it'll
Yeah.
be gone.
Exactly. That's what Holcomb's saying in this article. We need a global database, like a space artifact registry, to keep track of everything we've left, even a lost helicopter blade.
That sounds like a lot of work. But it also seems really important if we want future generations to be able to see and learn from those first steps we took in space.
Oh, it is a massive project, but like the payoff could be incredible too. We're not just saving stuff,
Yeah.
receiving knowledge, history, inspiration for people who haven't even been born yet.
And it's not even just about what we can learn from the stuff itself, but like where it is on Mars. In the article, Holcomb talks of the stratigraphy. That's what archaeologists use on Earth, to figure out how old things are based on the layers of dirt and rock.
Right, that's a great point. Here on Earth, they call it superposition. The idea that like in a layer of rock that hasn't been messed with, the oldest stuff's on the bottom and the newest on top. Like reading a history book from bottom to top.
But Mars doesn't have those neat layers, does it? How do they do archaeology there?
Well, it's not about doing it exactly the same way. Think about impact craters. The more craters there are, the older the surface is, probably. So if you find something near a lot of craters, it's probably pretty old. If it's on a smoother surface, maybe not so much.
So like a rover track on a really crater plane would be older than one on a smooth plane. It's like a Martian clock.
Exactly. And the more data we get from orbit and from rovers, the better we get at figuring out how old things are. It's like putting together a giant jigsaw puzzle. Each piece, each artifact and where it is tells us more of the story.
Speaking of the Martian environment, it's not exactly easy on stuff, right? We talked about rust and the dust storms. But what else is trying to destroy these artifacts?
There's a whole bunch of stuff. The article mentions radiation from the sun, which can like break down materials over time.
Okay.
And the temperature swings, they can cause things to crack and break because they expand and contract. And then there's micrometeorites, tiny little pieces of space debris that are constantly hitting the surface and wearing stuff down.
It's like Mars is playing a game of Jenga with our stuff, trying to knock it all down.
That's a good way to put it. And Holcomb says one of the biggest threats, especially in the long run, is getting buried by sand dunes. Remember the Spirit rover getting trapped in that dune field?
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about.
It is kind of poetic, you know,
Right.
this amazing machine being reclaimed by Mars. But it also makes it super clear why we need that database.
Right.
If we don't keep track of this stuff, we'll lose it.
Absolutely. And it's not just the big stuff, the rovers and landers.
Oh.
Holcomb even talks about a lost helicopter blade. Every little piece even that matters. It adds to the story.
It's like each artifact is a thread in a tapestry, and if we lose too many threads, the picture's not complete. With all these new missions going to Mars, you know, bringing samples back, astronauts, maybe even a base, how do we explore more without destroying what's already there?
That's the big question, isn't it? Archaeologists have been dealing with that for centuries. How do you study the past without changing it? How do we make sure future generations can learn from it too?
It's like walking a tightrope between science and just being respectful. And as we go further out into space, that's going to get harder and harder.
Exactly. And it's something we need to talk about now while we're still early in the game.
This has been an amazing deep dive so far. And before we go, I want to mention one more thing from the article that really stood out. Holcomb writes about the Mars 2 crash back in 1971. He says it's the first time our species left a preserved imprint on the surface of another planet.
It's a pretty powerful idea, isn't it? It changes how you think about things.
Yeah.
We're not just exploring, we're changing the universe.
Yeah, we're not just visitors anymore. We're part of the story. And every little thing we leave behind, whether we mean to or not, it becomes part of that story.
It's pretty exciting, but also kind of scary. We're creating something that could last longer than our whole civilization.
It really makes you think, what would future generations think if they found this stuff? What would aliens think? What would they learn about us? Yeah, it really is mind-blowing, like a rover wheel or an old flag just sitting there on Mars turning into artifacts.
It's wild, right? Imagine like hundreds of years from now, Martian archaeologists are digging and they find a piece of an antenna. What would they think, you know? Would they be impressed, or would they think we were just messing up their planet?
That's a good point. We've been talking about like the science and the history, but what about just the feeling of it? You know, what do these things say about us? Like, what were we hoping for? What were we afraid of?
That's a really deep question. And it gets to the heart of what space archaeology is all about. It's not just making a list of stuff. It's trying to understand what it means. What stories do these objects tell? What were we trying to say, even if we didn't realize it?
So are we just leaving a mess, you know, like breadcrumbs but messier? Or are we trying to say something to the future? Or maybe even to aliens?
I think that's the challenge, to be aware of what we leave behind. You know, to realize it's saying something about us. It's about changing how we think about space. Instead of just going there to take stuff, it's about taking care of it.
It's like we're writing a new chapter in human history. And the things we leave on Mars, those are the words. But what do we want that story to be?
That's the question, isn't it? And that's what makes space archaeology so cool. It makes you think about who we are and where we fit in the universe and what kind of future we want to create.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into space archaeology, I want to leave you with one last question. If you could bring back one thing from Mars, what would it be and why?
That's a good one to think about. What object really speaks to you? What's the story behind it? And what does your choice say about you? And if you want to dive deeper into all this, check out the Nature Astronomy article by Justin Holcomb. It's a great read, and it'll really make you think.
Until next time, keep looking up, keep asking questions, and keep exploring the universe.